Hi everyone, and welcome to the Tutor Hive Masterclass. Today we've got Martina, who is going to be talking about a healthy brain and a healthy mind. In times of today, where mental health is such a big problem and is almost another epidemic globally, it's important to look after the brain as much as possible and make sure that we're able to keep fit, healthy, mentally, physically, as well as every other way financially. So what we've got to do today is quickly run through a little bit about Tutor Hive, some of the changes, some of the exciting things we're doing, and then Martina is going to be sharing how the healthy brain and mind come together. So get the next slide, please. Cool. So Tutor Hive is a platform built to connect and make the educational ecosystem accessible. Right. What we found is that on the next, if you click again, that the education system is not working. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to innovate, engage, and drive personal growth and development. So we've got 3 pillars, and they'll just show each time we click. And the first one is that education is an enabler for global development. It's the fundamental thing that will help us with all of our challenges across from poverty, environmental challenges, water, hunger, etc. We also believe that technology can make the world a better place. You've seen lots of things about how AI is coming to the forefront, how technology is making things really efficient. What we're here to do is trying to implement those into education so that everyone can unlock their true potential. We're very quick in society to mark someone as uneducated, dumb, failing, and that paints a future for them, which then reduces their opportunities. So we want to make sure that we're able to unlock that. So the next slide, please. Now, the educational landscape is full of challenges, unfortunately. We've had things like the technology gap, the lack of investment in technology and moving things forward. We also see that after the COVID-19 pandemic, that lots of school kids have been negatively impacted both academically and socially. And this is compounded by the budget cuts as well, where schools are not getting the funding they need. In fact, they've lost over £1.3 billion since 2015 in real world spending capability. And it's a huge amount. And this is also then made even more difficult by the increased cost of everything. And I'm sure, like myself, everyone's feeling that pinch and continues to do so. So if you go to the next slide, please. Now, finding the right tutor first time is difficult. And if we click through, you've got a family that are looking to connect with a tutor. Now, the average student goes through 3 tutors before finding the right one. And that's expensive because it's £30 on average per lesson. Now, if you click, we can see that actually it's a bad journey as well, because the student is trying to learn a subject they're struggling with and having to try again and again and again before finally finding a tutor that is right for them. So not only does it make it more expensive, it also consumes a lot more time and it disengages the child. What we're doing with our Hive matching algorithm is we're using personality, hobbies and interests, learning style, teaching style, and using that to help find the right tutor first time. Streamlining the process, improving the learning journey as well, and reducing the cost. So it sounds pretty good, right? And on the next slide, we're going to talk about how that comes together to make a better system for the future. So today, a tutor would charge £30 and the student would pay £30. However, we've seen a shift in how things are moving, where not only do you get to use the platform, but actually you can use the platform to join study groups. Now, these study groups have 6 students in them. And the reason for 6 is through all of the research that we've done and the papers that we've read, we found that it's an effective amount to both have the benefits of teamwork, because you can split into 2 threes. And that way you can get 2 teams to work together. You can add a little bit of creativity and competitiveness. And also you can break it into 3 pairs. So you can really use the best of the online platform. And in doing so, we can also allow our students to pay from £15 an hour, and the tutors can earn £55 an hour. Now that sounds like magic, but because what we do is we build these group sessions, we get 6 students in, we're able to pay our tutors incredibly well. And a tutor will earn on average £880 from 4 hours a week. A student would pay £60 for a month of learning, whilst we make £560. So what we've done is we've built a business model where everyone wins, and we're in a position where we can now start to drive real change in the industry. So next slide, please. And this is where it gives us the opportunity to host things like webinars and share the information. And so I'm now going to hand it over to Martina, who is going to share a little bit more about herself, what she's going to be talking about, and we're looking forward to having that. And please remember, there is a chat function and a Q&A function. You can use those to ask questions. So if you have got any questions, please drop them into the chat or the Q&A button. We will pick those up and the team will be able to pass them over, and we will be discussing those at the end. So away you go, Martina.
Thank you very much, Roshan. Welcome to the 5th webinar of my project, Preventing Alzheimer's with Food and Lifestyle. This time we're looking at brain health and the effects of a healthy brain, on a slightly different lens, through a slightly different lens, in that we're not just looking at what happens later in life, but also what it feels like to have a healthy brain, organically healthy brain today, and the link between organic brain health and mental health. Just a few words about me. I've had neurodegenerative disease, so I know what it feels like to have a brain that is just not working anymore. And so that was really the trigger for my passion to give people access to tools to keep their brain organically healthy, and with that take away the fear of ever losing their cognitive abilities later in life with Alzheimer's. That is yet again another epidemic of our time. So now let's jump right in. Now the structure of this webinar will be very much focus is, as mentioned, so title is Healthy Brain, Healthy Mind. And as always in this series, it's always about the long-term brain health with a view to preventing Alzheimer's disease. And here we're looking at very much what is the link between mental health and brain health today, considering that depression and anxiety and such mental health challenges are just ubiquitous in these times, let's put it that way. And so the structure is really that we'll start with a high-level overview of Alzheimer, the disease, its risk factors and its types. You'll see the risk factors as well as types of this disease are very complex, and there are very different points that we can actually make conscious decisions about. The next point is really depression and Alzheimer's. What are the scenarios? What are the links? Depression as a mental health challenge or an impairment, and Alzheimer's usually are discussed as very different things, very separate things, but there are actually a lot of links of being depressed now at a younger age or at an older age, and how that links together with Alzheimer's. So we'll shed some light on that. Very specifically, the link of inflammation between depression and Alzheimer's. What role does inflammation play in depression? What role does inflammation play in Alzheimer's? And then, of course, the big question of what actually is inflammation. So we'll go into that a little bit more to give some understanding. And as always, I'm talking about so many things that you will have heard before that is covered in mass media. And so many people have heard terms like amyloid beta and tau, but it's incredibly hard for a layperson to really categorize that. Where does it all fit together? And that is really very much a goal of this webinar, to give you a bit more context and understanding of all these terms. And of course, to always have, for you to have a takeaway as to what you can actually do to positively impact your life and your brain. Now, the next question after we look into what is inflammation, the big question, how does the brain get inflamed? What are the mechanisms there? And then we'll go into the gut-brain axis, again, a term that you may have heard about before. So we'll explain that a little bit. And then very much after you've had the theory, the mechanisms, the takeaway as to what does that mean for me, for my body, for my life, how can I recognize my own pro-inflammatory state or a state of inflammation, and what does that look like? What is it that I really can avoid, should avoid? And towards the end, we will cover inspiration for a healing, anti-inflammatory life, and very much what are the aspects that make the body fundamentally healthy, and body and brain. Of course, we're one system, so it's never the brain and the body as separate, but we're one system. So that is a very important view to take, I think. Then I will give you a bit more insight into my project. The limited company is called Viatitude Health Limited, and project name Let's Make 80 History. So I'll give you a bit more insight into how it's going to work. And at the end, we'll have some further resources, lots of very interesting books and articles to read. There's a podcast that I would recommend to give you just a bit more insight. And as always, please, as Rushab also mentioned, please type your questions into the Q&A function, or otherwise raise your hand. And I think then Rushab will pick that up. And if that's relevant, we can always, or I can always interrupt and answer a question right at that point. Right, so let's jump right in. So the Alzheimer's disease risk factors are multifactorial, quite complex, as mentioned. So we have on the one hand the genetics, family story, external factors, so environmental factors, comorbidities, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity, trauma, head trauma, so various factors, and they very often are very much interlinked. I've highlighted here depression very much. That is, of course, the big question, is depression a risk factor for Alzheimer's, or is Alzheimer's essentially a disease that will lead to depression in an Alzheimer's patient? But really, these webinars are really all about identifying the modifiable risk factors. And I think depression is something that we have, to some extent, the ability to improve our situation with food and lifestyle choices that I will go into a bit later. So this slide is really not for you to take notes and learn by heart, but really just to recognize it's very complex and very interlinked, as the disease itself is. Because Alzheimer's is really, first of all, two very fundamentally different diseases in terms of mechanism: late onset and early onset. Early onset is the type that is very rare, usually just or around 2% of cases. And that starts from the age of 45, so very early. And that is driven by 3 gene variants. And it's very much deterministic. So carriers of these 3 gene variants are incredibly likely to develop Alzheimer's disease, or is essentially inevitable. Very rare cases, and that is not something that suddenly pops up. That is hereditary, so any patient would know about that genetic predisposition. And the late onset type is really from the age of 65. That is really the type that is the very common type, and that again has 5 or 6 different types, as you can see here on the slide. Depending on which researcher you follow, it might be 5 types or 6 types. Here you'll see in the top bubble where inflammatory is highlighted in red, glycotoxic is in the same bubble. So you could see it as 5 or 6. In any case, I'll just give you an overview over what these types are. And very important to keep in mind, an Alzheimer's patients will very likely have more than one type, meaning that we are all constantly exposed to so many different environmental factors that it is very unlikely that we just develop one type. We would just develop one type, and of course we're trying to prevent here, so hopefully we never will. But so that of course makes the disease, or any disease in any patient, even more complex because it is so highly individual. So one of the types is the glycotoxic type, and you may have heard about the concept that diabetes 2 patients are at very high risk of Alzheimer's. Essentially, the mechanism is diabetes 2 can or has a high likelihood of turning into diabetes 3, and that is diabetes of the brain, meaning the neurons cannot actually access the glucose that they need to function, so they no access to the energy they need to function. The second type, on the right, the atrophic type, that is really the type where the brain just doesn't have enough nutrients, the required nutrients. That can be anything from the minerals to the hormones we talked about last time in the female brain. The risk factors, of course, the drop of estrogen, but there are various hormones and various nutrients, lots of minerals that the brain needs in sufficient amounts. Vitamin D is, of course, a huge thing. So that is the second type, really. The traumatic type, that is really very much head trauma. So you may have heard about football players or athletes that have had, or American football players, rugby players, that have had repeated severe trauma to the head. And that is a huge risk factor. So it's essentially the brain is just being bruised every time it receives a hard knock. The brain, the soft organ in the hard skull, is crashing against the skull, and with that is being bruised, structures are being destroyed, and of course any such impact is an inflammatory event in itself. So the traumatic type is a very problematic one, and it's now emerging, as you may have heard. The NFL in the States has now started to recognize traumatic brain injury as a huge factor for long-term disability or early death. The vascular type, that is really essentially cardiovascular disease that a patient may have. So heart disease that is then essentially spreading to the vascular system in the brain, and with that, and not providing enough oxygen, not providing enough nutrients. There's this concept of vascular leakiness, meaning that the integrity of the vascular system is unraveling. And with that, there is simply not enough of oxygen and nutrients being transported to the neurons as needed for a healthy function. And the toxic type, that is really exposure to environmental toxins, anything exhaust fumes. People living on a very, very busy street, for example, are exposed to so much more toxicity from cars. But also amalgam fillings in the teeth emit mercury, and mercury is, of course, a heavy metal that is highly toxic for the brain. Mycotoxins, another huge topic around toxicity. So that's mycotoxins are really the toxins that are emitted from mold. So living in a very old building where there may be some dark, damp corners, that is a very big risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. So that is definitely important to know if you have a mold in the building, and to remove it as diligently as possible, because that is a very, very large problem. And here I highlighted in red the inflammatory type. And that is really, you may have guessed already, that is really the big link between Alzheimer's, depression, and the systemic inflammation of the body, and of course that is inflammation in the brain as well. And inflammation in the brain, on the one hand, may lead to acutely depressive symptoms in a patient, but in the very long term is increasing the risk factor and the risk for Alzheimer's disease. And the mechanism is really that with upregulated inflammation, so certain inflammatory markers like NF-kappa beta, that really fosters the increased production of amyloid beta, and that is one of the biomarkers of Alzheimer's that you may have heard about before. So let's jump into depression and Alzheimer's. So first of all, what are the scenarios? There are a number of different hypotheses. As mentioned before, the vascular disease, so that is one type. The alteration of the glucocorticoid, steroids, and hippocampal atrophy. So that is really the hippocampus atrophying, so shrinking. And that again is a result or a likely result or a hypothesized result of a glucose metabolism or impaired glucose metabolism. The increased deposition of amyloid beta plaques, and here I cited the paper here at the bottom. It is really also increased deposition of hyperphosphorylated tau. And so these are the two biomarkers of Alzheimer's. Inflammatory changes I've highlighted here. That is one of the hypotheses how depression and Alzheimer's may coexist. Of course, question is chicken or egg. What is the starting point? What's the risk factor? What is the result? And of course, deficits in nerve growth factor or neurotrophins. So the factors that the brain simply needs to function optimally. So I would always call it brain food. So essentially the minerals, the hormones, the vitamins. So the nerve growth factor is of course one of the brain foods, if you will. So now let's dive into the inflammatory link between depression and Alzheimer's. So what you see there is very much what has been established so far. The finding that depression is an inflammatory condition of the brain, of the organ, is I think that it already started to emerge 25 years ago, but that is still considered very much emerging research. And while quite a lot of the very much established antidepressant drugs have a very strong anti-inflammatory component in them, the isolation of depression being an inflammatory condition of the brain, that is still quite a progressive statement to make. I think that is definitely very much a lens through which we need to look at brain health and the effect of an imbalance in brain health, because the results are very, very obvious and very debilitating in the short term. So a depressed patient has, of course, a very strongly diminished quality of life. And of course, Alzheimer's is in different ways, but it's incredibly, it's not just quality of life, it's really ending the patient as he or she used to be, simply because the memories, the abilities just disappear, which is of course something that we want to definitely avoid. So that really, just to give a bit of context. So first of all, depressive modes are known as a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. And at the same time, of course, Alzheimer's patients are very likely to be depressed, simply by the nature of their condition. It has been found that patients with depressive symptoms are showing 30% higher measures of brain inflammation, so inflammatory markers, versus healthy controls, so age-adjusted, context-adjusted controls. So that, I think, is a very important number to keep in mind. And one of the mechanisms how inflammation may foster or increase the risk for Alzheimer's disease may very well be the mechanism of sleep, or rather inflammation hindering high quality sleep in terms of length and depth of sleep. And during sleep, the brain is really cleaned from debris, from pathogens, from proteins, from various things that are deposited there during the day through whatever mechanism. And I think we talked about that in a webinar a little while ago. So it's very much the glymphatic system that is removing debris from the brain. And that is so important because, of course, Alzheimer's is essentially a very slow process of accumulation of proteins and plaques in the brain that we definitely want to intervene with, not just let that happen. And yeah, so it's really all about sleep and the sleep quality, the length of the sleep, the uninterrupted sleep. That is really where the brain is able to perform. It's very much its clean-up mechanism, or rather the glymphatic system in the brain is able to really clean things out. So really, the question is really, what is actually inflammation? Inflammation is being talked about in mass media so often, and everybody is saying like inflammation is the basis of all disease, of all evil. But is it always? And I think we need to differentiate very much between the type of inflammation, because fundamentally, inflammation is the healthy response of the immune system to really heal damaged tissue or to get rid of any foreign invaders, any bacteria, any pathogens. And so, first of all, inflammation is a very good thing. It's not a pleasant thing for the patient, for the person, but it's a very important thing. It's part of the body's self-healing mechanism. And really, all organs, any organ of the body can be inflamed. I mean, you know very well what happens when you get bitten by a toxic little insect, or you cut yourself. The redness, the swelling, that is inflammation. But what we definitely need to do is, while that sort of inflammation, that sort of immune response is very good, there are two types of inflammation. One is very good and one is very bad. So what is the good type is really the acute inflammation. You cut yourself, it's red, skin is broken, but it's healing, and that is an immune response. That is a great mechanism. And as I said, you will always see it. It will be swollen, it will be red, it will be hot. But that is really the immune system at work of healing, which is great. What is not great is the chronic type. So the type of inflammation that just doesn't go away. And the acute type will just dampen down once the injury or the whatever issue that was has to be removed. The swelling, the redness, the heat will go away. In a state of chronic inflammation, that is really a very bad thing, because that means the immune system is just constantly upregulated and is fighting something that the immune system recognizes as an enemy, recognizes as a problem, recognizes as something that needs to be healed, needs to be removed. But that is usually the state where the body is really misunderstanding something, is mistaking something that we think it's just food, or it's just something we just do. But if the body recognizes that as something foreign and something that needs to be removed because it is damaging, with that, this immune system is constantly upregulated. And with that, that is really chronic inflammation, and which very likely turns into systemic inflammation, meaning it's not just in one location. It will be essentially the entire body, really affecting all organs in the body. And the chronic state, or the state of systemic inflammation, that is incredibly dangerous in terms of, on the one hand, it uses up so much energy for a complete pointless exercise, because there is no actual enemy there. The body mistakes something for an enemy. And at the same time, a chronically upregulated immune system is very much at risk of going even more crazy, and that would be autoimmunity. And that is when the own immune system starts to attack own tissue, because it recognizes that as an enemy. So that's definitely a point that we definitely want to avoid. And so the state of chronic inflammation is very often, most likely, a state that we get into when we constantly do something, eat, drink, something that the body just does not really understand what that's supposed to be, doesn't recognize that as food, but recognize that as an enemy. So that's really high level, the inflammation. And the question is, of course, we're just talking about possibly food or something the body, the immune system may recognize as an invader, as an enemy, and starts a fight. But how does the brain actually get inflamed? So the organ brain. And so there are different pathways. On the one hand, it can be a very direct impact. I think I mentioned that in the types. The TBI, traumatic brain injury, that is really a severe knock to the head, where the soft organ, the brain, is crushed against the skull, the very hard skull. And that's, of course, an injury. And that an injury causes an inflammatory response trying to heal. And of course, inflammation in the brain works very differently to the rest of the body, and that the brain is a highly complex organ, and there are things that we have in the body otherwise to deal with injury that the brain just doesn't have. So traumatic brain injury has severe repercussions, and of course an inflammatory state in the brain through TBI is very hard to end, and brain tissue is injured very easily and destroyed in some cases, and of course that interrupts so many functions in the whole body, and with that interrupts functions of self-healing. Another direct way of inflammation starting in the brain is really pathogens. So you may have heard about the condition meningitis or encephalitis. So that is the inflammation of the membrane around the brain or the brain itself, and that is caused by bacteria or viruses. And even fungi or parasites can enter the brain through incredibly unfortunate circumstances, being that a wound to the head, and that of course is awfully close to the brain, or other pathways, ingestion even. And there are indirect ways, and I mentioned autoimmunity before. There are several pathways how the immune system may inflame the brain through simply mistaking neurons as foreign invaders. That was the case in my case, so that's why I know about that. So that all sounds very, very exotic, but these mechanisms may happen with a chronically upregulated immune system that is just constantly fighting, and is starting to mistake own tissue, own cells for things that it recognizes as an outside invader. The glutinous protein, for example, or one of the glutinous proteins, may look very similar to a brain cell. So that's how autoimmunity may affect the brain. So there are several mechanisms. Autoimmunity is very complex and it can affect various different organs. Fundamentally, the mechanism is it's not simple, but it is very much driven by essentially substances that end up in the bloodstream that don't belong there, and with that the immune system being upregulated. Another indirect way is toxic exposures, and that is really toxic fumes and toxic foods even, or foods that have been treated with glyphosate or other toxins that are essentially ingested, and with that end up in the bloodstream, and with that end up in the bloodstream of the brain as well. A very important pathway that we are very much focusing on here is what we eat, what we ingest. That can, in the first instance, inflame our gut. And foods that are very, very common that we all eat pretty much every day, high in sugar, some with artificial sweetness such as aspartame, processed foods containing lots of ingredients that are essentially foreign to the human body because they've only been recently, over the last few decades, chemically engineered, but that are not actually really food that the body knows. So, and anything that the body doesn't really know will trigger some sort of inflammatory response and immune response. And that is in the gut. And of course, anything we eat goes through the system and will end up in the gut. And that is really the intersection where nutritious foods we eat will get into the nutrients, will get into the bloodstream through the permeability of the small intestine. But if elements get into the bloodstream that don't really belong there, that is really when the immune system is being upregulated, and that may very well be the start of chronic or systemic inflammation. And another important point is really the fact that we're now eating way too much constantly, that many people now have food intolerances, which may be on the one hand driven by the fact that it's much more recognized now. But I would always argue the number of food intolerances has increased so much because the foods we eat now have nothing to do with what even our parents ate when they were small. So the food engineering has just gone to completely different levels now, and will very likely trigger responses in people that are very unpleasant. And of course, the constant eating, the constant snacking is, again, an issue that stresses the gut, in the sense that the gut needs periods of 12 to 16 hours of not digesting, not dealing with food, not processing, not metabolizing, but actually just healing the permeable membrane that is only supposed to let through anything that is really a nutrient, not just random stuff, so that the bloodstream will not actually be inundated with things that don't actually belong there. So now we have started to introduce the concept of there are some ways to directly trigger inflammation in the brain, but very much the pathway is really via the gut. So the big question is now, how does the brain get inflamed if the gut is inflamed? And that brings us to a concept that you may have heard about before, the gut-brain axis. And that is a very interesting concept that has been discovered probably 20, 30 years ago. And that is the concept that the brain and the gut are connected with, I think, 10 cranial nerves. And there's one specific one, it's called the vagus nerve. And that is really a bidirectional communication between the brain and the gut. And it's really the emotional and cognitive center of the brain, and the enteric nervous system, that is the nervous system of the gut, are communicating with each other. And in that context, you may have heard the term often, I have this gut feeling. And that is really what this really means, that the gut and the brain communicates, and the gut communicates the very deep responses, and that the brain is then able to actually verbalize and turn that into something that we can actually understand. And so, yeah, as I said, the communication between the gut and the brain really works via the vagus nerve, where the inflammatory markers are also transported. And we talked about foods that are inflammatory for the gut. So if there is inflammation in the gut via the vagus nerve, these inflammatory markers are communicated to the brain, and that is really what triggers an inflammatory state in the brain. And so we've talked about how inflammation in the brain is really a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, and inflammation in the brain and inflammatory states of the brain is a very likely factor, a very important factor likely in depression. We've seen that 30% of severely depressed patients were showing, or rather, the brains of severely depressed patients were showing 30% higher inflammatory markers than healthy controls. So that, again, is another very important aspect to keep in mind, why our brain health, keeping that not inflamed, is so incredibly important for our health now and our long-term health, so meaning Alzheimer's prevention or dementia prevention. So avoiding pro-inflammatory states is incredibly important. Pro-inflammatory always sounds like a good thing, but that really means these are states of inflammation that the human body can be in. And so it is very important to recognize that these states are actually increased inflammation states that we definitely want to avoid, because that is really, avoidance is so much easier now versus in 30, 40 years, when cognitive impairment starts to rear its ugly head. And so these are very common states that we may find ourselves in, and possibly this list might be inspiration for you to actually tackle certain things, the slight overweight that you've noticed since Christmas or whatever it is, to actually tackle that now with a view to it's actually incredibly important for brain health. So I've listed here a few points, very important nutritional deficiencies, things like vitamin D, Magnesium is so incredibly common in this world. So that is definitely something to focus on. Vitamin D, we can only produce ourselves if UVB rays hit our skin. And enough of that. So depending on how far north we live, it might be harder. So vitamin D may be an issue that we may only be able to solve with supplementation. But other nutritional deficiencies, such as magnesium, we may very likely be able to counter with food intake, dark leafy vegetables. But of course, magnesium is in dark chocolate. Of course, they're very important to watch sugar content. But raw cocoa, there are a number of foods that we can take in, so to make sure that we have enough of the important nutrients. I think the next point, we all know that obesity, high blood pressure, high bad cholesterol, low good cholesterol. Yeah, we all know that. It's just a matter of tackling that. The thyroid function, or the imbalanced thyroid function, is a little bit more complex, because that is very much a hormonal imbalance, and to rebalance hormones is a process that is very involved. I think very often people that are diagnosed with a thyroid dysfunction will get thyroxine or thyroid medication. That is, of course, an option, but I would always argue look at the underlying issue and fix the root cause. The detoxification of the body, incredibly important. Liver, kidney, lymphatic system, to make sure that we actually excrete whatever toxins we may have ingested because they taste so good, the chocolate, the ice cream, the alcohol, whatever it was. If we have such treats, we want to make sure that our detoxification system actually works well. The environmental toxins, they usually don't taste so great, but of course, so we're exposed to them at all times, or most of the time. So again, very important that our detox pathways work well. Smoking, alcohol consumption, I think I don't even need to mention that. Sedentary lifestyle, that is something that is being talked about so much. And there, I think it is very important to know it's not a matter of having to join the gym and go for crazy daily workouts and just extreme stuff, which of course may create so much resistance with people that I don't want to do that. But it is really a matter of walking, going for a brisk walk, using the stairs. That in itself is already incredibly helpful for human health, for cardiovascular health, but also brain health. So that is something to realize that is a pro-inflammatory state that we want to avoid. Of course, high stress is the same thing as too little and low quality sleep. Something to very much manage with, being that meditation or putting together a protocol of sleep hygiene, they call it. So to not eat certain hours before sleep, to not be exposed to blue light, to not engage in excitatory activities and workout a few hours before sleep, and so on. So that is something very important to focus on. Low quality short sleep is a huge risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. So that is a very, very important thing. It's not a luxury to sleep, it's an absolute essential to sleep. And the last point here, I think, is very important to keep in mind. And I think that has been talked about since COVID and the lockdowns, very much what a detrimental effect social isolation has on human health. And there may be different pathways. And I think one is very much, we are social creatures. We need the intellectual stimulation, but it's also very much a physiological thing that our gut microbiome is such an incredibly important organ in our body. And it's so incredibly important for immunity, for who we actually are, our personality, our ability to think, our ability to actually be the person that we should be. And to have a healthy microbiome, we need microbial diversity. And the best way to maintain microbial diversity is social interactions. So having close friends, getting a hug, from friends. And so with this enforced social isolation during the lockdowns, that may very likely have been one of the triggers for this depression. Huge wave of depression that we have seen since then. And another point that I just want to mention here on the side is toxic behaviors that we possibly recognize in ourselves, but that is something we can change. But toxic behaviors in people around us that are incredibly inflammatory, in the sense that you may notice in yourself how that changes your mood, your stress level, your heartbeat. If somebody around you is just being incredibly annoying, incredibly, toxic, and that is another pro-inflammatory item that we definitely want to consciously remove, I would say. So after now that we have an overview of what pro-inflammatory states there are, and this slide really gives an overview, really inspiration as to what is actually a healing anti-inflammatory life. Everybody is different. That's always incredibly important to remember. So there is no one perfect human nutrition, one perfect human lifestyle. We're all different in terms of our genetics, our ethnic backgrounds, our educations, our likes, our dislikes, our experiences. But there are a few things that are really applicable on a high level to all humans. The foods we eat really need to meet our individual requirements in terms of nutrients, being that minerals, vitamins, and neurotransmitters. So everything really to have our body function optimally, and of course, avoiding anything that is inflammatory. So the raw, unprocessed organic foods are probably, of course, ideal, low in sugar, high in fiber. I think very important here is that is the ideal scenario. So it is still incredibly important to have pleasure in what we eat. So just going for cardboard, no sugar, high in fiber, that cannot last. That will likely result in some sort of extreme response for just eating anything and everything. And so I think the ideal scenario is really to just constantly watch oneself, not to overdo it on something that we know is not good, but at the same time not totally deny ourselves of foods and things that we enjoy. That's very important. The healthy habits, so of course exercise, stress management, sleep hygiene, as mentioned before, so regular sleep times, sleep length, no food before sleep, bright lights, blue lights, anything like that can interrupt sleep. Below there, the point purpose in life, that is an incredibly, of course, that is a very elusive point, but has been found in, you may have heard about the blue zones, which are the 5 areas all over the globe where people get over 100 years old and stay healthy physically and cognitively. And one thing why these are very different spots on the planet in, I don't know, California and in Japan and in Sardinia, all these people have a purpose, a reason to get up in the morning. So that is very, very important really for the overall human experience, if you will. So that really reduces our inflammation levels very much. Positive connections, on the one hand, a community, social connections, people to do stuff with, and mental stimulation, interesting conversations, inspiration. And that is definitely something that is very much needed by humans. And you may recall, after you've been spending the day with a wonderful person, how that makes you feel versus spending the day with annoying people. So that is something just to be aware of. Toxin exposure, alcohol, tobacco. Okay, we all know that. Environmental toxins. There, I think what we can do really is, as mentioned before, make sure our detoxification pathways work well to really remove all that. Okay, and that now brings me to a short overview of my project. So my project is really very much what these webinars are all about. It's very much giving people the access and understanding to what food and lifestyle choices to make to improve their brain health and prevent Alzheimer's disease in the future, and how this will work is really as an algorithmic tool, a mobile app or a desktop app that gives tailored guidance to the user, tailored to the user profile. So in the user profile, risk factors are very clearly recognizable, and the algorithm picks up which risk factors are of the highest priority and what interventions can actually be taken by the user, him or herself, to reduce that risk. So their view is very much organic brain health now and later in life. And with that, we come to the further resources. So as mentioned, there are a number of incredibly interesting books around for people who would like to know a bit more. And I think in this whole context of healthy brain, healthy mind, probably my favorite author is Daniel Amen. He's a psychologist, an American psychologist, and he was really one of the very progressive ones who started to take brain scans of his patients, and he recognized that depressive patients have a different manifestation of their brain on the scans. And with that, he really established the notion that depression is an inflammatory condition of the brain. And while therapy, talking therapy, so many behaviors are incredibly helpful to get a patient out of a depressive mood, it is also an organic condition that needs to be addressed, just as well as a broken leg needs to be addressed with either surgery or a cast or something very targeted physiological treatment, rather than just talking to the broken leg. So that, I think, is an incredibly cool book that he wrote, The End of Mental Illness, and that I can recommend very much. And the other book, of course, my favorite, Dale Bredesen, The End of Alzheimer's. He gives an incredibly good overview of what actually it is that leads to this incredible increase of Alzheimer's. What is the mechanism? And he always says Alzheimer's should be a rare disease. And of course, right now, Alzheimer's is not a rare disease, but the way he argues is really, it is a lifestyle disease, and we can make lifestyle modifications. And with that, we can all together make it a rare disease again. That's really the goal. Here I'm listing one podcast by Peter Attia, and that is a very interesting conversation that he's having about how to optimize brain health. So I can very much recommend that. And these slides that you see now, there will be a recording, so you can then take that link from the recording. And a few articles that are just outlining very interesting the link between inflammation and depression, and inflammation in dementia. So the first one is from the Journal of Psychologists in the US, and the other one is from PubMed. So that's this big database of scientific papers that is publicly accessible and is full of amazing papers and information that I can very much recommend. So that brings us to the end of my presentation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Martina. And that was really informative. Lots of stuff about the food impact. I had one question for you about, obviously nowadays lots of people feel low. It's like, when you have those dips and you're like, oh, it's just a bit draggy or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
Are there any sort of quick fixes that anyone can apply? So obviously, yes, there's a long-term thing you have to focus on, etc. But what are there any sort of like immediate reliefs that we can get from a mental brain detox that we can do like instantly, like, I want it now?
I think an incredibly powerful tool is definitely exercise. So that doesn't mean you have to run a marathon, but literally to leave the house, to walk around, to move. Really, movement is what has an immediate positive effect. And of course, movement without drinking water. Very, very important. Sounds so incredibly simplistic, but I think you can speak to anyone. And when they come back from a big run, how great they feel, even though they're exhausted and everything. But that really has such a positive, immediate effect. So hydration, incredibly important. And I think what is very important, what has quite an immediate effect as well, is certain minerals that depressive patients may likely be low in, and that would be magnesium, zinc, vitamins B6, 9, 12. I think that could be something for that would have quite an immediate effect. I mean, taking magnesium, that usually has an effect within 30 minutes. So I think that could be a very good idea. And of course, a treat. I mean, a treat is always a good thing, but very important to not go for anything that is starchy or sugary, because that, of course, may have an immediate serotonin or dopamine effect, but the crash will be horrific.
Right.
But something like blueberries, very dark chocolate, and cashew nuts, because I think cashew nuts are high in zinc. That might be a very good thing. And depending on time of day and of course the taste of what that person likes to eat, high protein, a grilled chicken breast, olive oil. So oil and protein, fat and protein, high quality, may actually be a very immediate positive effect on the brain of somebody who's just feeling low and really shitty. Certainly that is something for if you need a quick fix, rather than somebody who's just been in the deep darkness for a long time. That may require a bit more than just a few blueberries.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and appreciate the time. Lots of insight. It's been really good to have you. And yeah, no, I think the whole linking brain health with education, mental well-being, it all comes together. We're very complex. Everything does come together. It's got to be eating well, keeping sane, keeping on the ball. It all comes together, right? And it's interesting to see, and actually it's a big link of why we're putting on these webinars. And it's been it's all about trying to broaden the horizons. And so hopefully you've all enjoyed the webinar today by Martina. And again, if you're interested in anything to do with what we were talking about around Tutor Hive as well, we put these on for free to help educate, share a lot of information. Obviously, it'll be available on recorded as well, so you can go back and watch this as many times over, you know, just to take those little nuggets. I think if you watch it back again, you pick up more and more. And feel free to get in touch. So my name is Rishabh. I'm the co-founder of Tutor Hive, and thank you very much for joining our Hive Masterclass.
Thank you. Bye.